Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josephine Watson, Commercial Projects Editor at IGB, and I'll be chairing today's IGB webinar. We're delighted to be hosting a webinar with TransUnion today discussing their 2021 iGaming Fraud Trends Report. In what was a complex year for the iGaming industry, 2020 forced operators to adapt to emerging markets, acquisitions, compliance challenges, and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, all while preventing risks and positioning for growth. This webinar features TransUnion product expert Angie White as she reviews essential takeaways from the company's 2021 iGaming industry report, insights for building a trusted iGaming operation, and provides expert advice on better understanding players, earning their trust, and remaining competitive. I'll allow Angie to introduce herself fully shortly, but first, to run through a few housekeeping items. There'll be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please do submit questions as we go along, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible in the allocated time. You can do this by clicking onto the GoToWebinar interface, clicking on questions, and submitting them there. With that, I'm going to pass over to Angie.
Thank you, Josephine. So as Josephine mentioned, I'm with TransUnion. I help support our global fraud and identity solutions. So thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. I'm excited to share with you some of the findings from our 4th annual iGaming Fraud Trends Report. Before we dive in, just want to give a short introduction for those of you that might not be familiar with TransUnion. So TransUnion acquired iovation, that might be a name that a lot of you are familiar with, about 2.5 years ago. And since then, they've been, folding in all the iovation solutions. They brought that together with a number of other fraud and identity protection solutions to form our new True Validate brand. So that encompasses all of our fraud prevention, risk-based authentication, and identity proofing solutions. So just want to give that as an introduction so that everybody has a common understanding. So in the past year, we've helped protect over 110 gambling operators and platform providers worldwide. In 2020 alone, we protected over 576 million iGaming transactions and saw over 1 million confirmed fraud reports from our iGaming businesses that we help protect. And that's really where we draw a lot of the data that we analyze and use within the report is from those confirmed fraud reports from our iGaming operators. So we use that data to, analyze fraud trends and see what insights we can, share out with our customers and with, others within the industry. We saw a lot of change in 2020. I think we can all agree that 2020 was a year of big change. Specifically, the pandemic drove a lot of evolution within attack methods and risk factors within iGaming. We saw a 92% increase in risky digital transactions. So that's us combining reviews and denies. So we did see a big uptick in fraud attempts in 2020. So let's go ahead and dive in here. So these are the 3 main topics that we're going to cover here. So trends observed during the COVID-19 pandemic, how has that changed the landscape for iGaming as far as transactions, the way we interact with consumers, fraud trends, of course, how to secure the player journey while also providing a great experience for your players, and then effectively managing regulatory compliance. All right, so first let's talk about some of the trends that we saw in the pandemic. A clear trend that TU saw across really all sectors was a clear move online. Lockdowns and business closures pushed a record number of consumers online. In response, we've seen a rapid acceleration of digital transformation across most industries as businesses, did their best to move offline transactions online. As I'm sure many of you likely experienced, we saw a large initial decline in iGaming transactions when compared to the pre-COVID period. So we looked at the period January 1st to March 11th and compared that to similar time segments following the declaration of the pandemic. So in that first segment there, so that was that first like 3-month segment, we saw a 24% decline. A lot of that was driven due to declines in sports betting from suspension and postponement of competitions. Additionally, we saw that disposable income shrank for many consumers. We did a financial hardship study weekly at the beginning of the pandemic and have continued doing that monthly. We saw just in the UK, 61% of consumers reported that COVID-19 had adversely affected their household income. So, you know, we saw those early days, people were still adjusting. There was a lot of changes within the market. In the May to August timeframe, we actually saw a big bounce back with iGaming transactions. So that grew 40% over the previous period and 7% over the period from the beginning of the year, January to March. So took us back to about pre-COVID levels, a little bit. Overall, for the entire year 2020, we saw transactions increase 19% over 2019. So, you know, ended on a high note there with seeing, you know, iGaming have a good recovery. We saw, you know, a number of things I think were fueling that. One, operators were really innovative. We saw a lot of operators pivoting and setting up, you know, new types of events to bet on, things along those lines. So I think there was, you know, a lot of great nimbleness there within iGaming. Something else I'll point out, we actually did a survey with The Economist, and they looked at, they went and surveyed executives. Oops, sorry about that. I went the wrong direction. Bear with me for a second. So they actually went and surveyed executives about, you know, how they're feeling about the market in 2020. And from that, we saw that 2 out of 3 companies that had changed their digital transaction processes as a result of COVID had experienced glitches. So I think one of the things to note here is that, you know, you saw a lot of businesses that had to make this rapid change with bringing offline processes online. But I think there's going to be a lot of room for improvement there, right? So being able to optimize those digital processes, being able to improve that customer experience. So I think that's going to be a big area of focus in 2021 is, you know, now that, you know, that those digital transformations have sped up, now how can you take that a step further and optimize those experiences and make it a better experience for your players? Another consequence of the pandemic was that fraudsters took advantage to target consumers with digital fraud scams. So we saw a really large uptick in phishing scams specifically. In a consumer survey that we did, 35% of respondents reported having been targeted or having already fallen victim to a digital COVID-19 scam. So, and these came in a lot of different flavors, you know, that was like, I actually even heard of one in the US where they set up a testing site, a fake testing site. They had people coming in and they were drawing their blood, telling them they were going to get a COVID test and taking all their insurance information, getting all their personal data. And it happened that one of that, like somebody from the health authority drove by and saw it and questioned whether or not that was a legitimate site. So, I mean, it's just crazy how bold these, you know, fraudsters are being with some of these scams. So that was an example of one that we saw in the news, but we're also seeing lots of online scams where they're offering people cures, or they're offering to put them on a list to get a vaccine, things like that, in order to gain their personal data. That flood of stolen credentials and stolen personal data is now fueling other types of fraud attacks. So let's look at the trends there. So one of the first types of fraud that we're seeing come out of this is identity and synthetic fraud. So most of you are probably familiar with identity fraud. That's where somebody goes and they steal somebody's identity. They take it over and they take out credit. They do other types of transactions. Synthetic identity fraud is a little bit different. What they do is they take pieces of real identities and stitch them together. So maybe they use Josephine's name, and they use my social security number, and they use somebody else's address. So sometimes these are also called Frankenstein identities. So they take different pieces of real identities. So when you're verifying the individual elements, they check out, but it creates a new identity. So we saw a 52.5% increase in identity fraud in iGaming. A lot of that's likely due to, we're seeing more measures being put in place for identity proofing, KYC, things like that. So, fraudsters are having to get more sophisticated as they're setting up these fake identities in order to get around those types of measures at account origination. Next, account takeover. We saw a 36% increase in reports of account takeover in 2020. So account takeover, this is when a fraudster goes in and they take over a legitimate player's account for the purposes of committing fraud. So we see a number of attack methods here. This could be them going in to clear out the money sitting on a player's account. If it's a VIP account, there could be a lot of money sitting there. The other method we see with this is actually using these player accounts to move money through. So money launderers will use that to mask their activities. Number of attack methods we see there in talking to operators. Some of the common methods we see are what we call distraction attacks. So that's where they might attack your main site, and while you're distracted defending against that attack, they go in and they take over player accounts. We also see credential stuffing attacks, and this is where that data from those phishing scams starts to come in. The fraudsters, they'll go out on the dark web, they'll get a file of breached credentials, and they'll just try them out one by one on your site, and whichever ones they can gain access to, they go ahead and go in and take over the player account. We also see a lot of social engineering scams with account takeover, so that and this can also come through phishing. They might reach out to a target and pretend like they're the operator and they need them to give them access to their account to help with a payment issue, something like that. So a number of different ways that we're seeing fraudsters take over legitimate players' accounts. All right, next, payment fraud. So this was an interesting one. We actually saw reports of credit card fraud decrease 16%. A lot of this is likely due to some regulation changes within Europe. But what we saw was there was a 169% increase in ACH and debit fraud. So those are, direct transfers. So we're seeing this used a lot with like digital wallets, where, the consumer, they set up a direct withdrawal from their checking account rather than using a credit card, something along those lines. So, we are still seeing a lot of payment fraud. It's just shifting away from credit card fraud and moving towards ACH and debit fraud. All right. So, as you're looking at some ways to, optimize your digital transformation, really important to think about how you can build trust in faceless channels. So, as you're looking to, improve that player experience, really important to be able to gain a more accurate and comprehensive view of consumer identities, being able to work with partners that steward data with care and help ensure regulatory compliance, and being able to leverage digital and identity insights to protect transactions across the entire player life cycle. All right, so next let's talk about the player journey. What are some of the things that we're seeing here? So first off, we thought that we'd take a look at some of the global trends that we're seeing within gambling. So you can see some of the numbers that we pulled for annual revenue. We also looked at what were the top reported fraud categories by region. So within Europe and the UK, we saw customer requested exclusions was the #1 type of reported fraud or abuse. So that's been consistently the highest within Europe for a number of years, and that makes a lot of sense. So this is a lot of operators, they use the fraud reports to be able to track self-excluded players by their device. That helps keep them out of the game, helps them from returning with a new account. Promotion abuse, we saw this was #2 for Europe, South Africa, and #1 for Asia Pacific. So that's another consistent trend where we've seen bonus abuse being a big driver within iGaming, something that operators are looking to manage, and by using evidence reports, that's a good way to stop those types of repeat offenders. Within the United States, we saw the highest category was credit card fraud, which I thought was a little surprising. It could be with this that you're also seeing that a lot of consumers are using credit cards to set up digital wallets. So it could be that that's coming through digital wallets, and we're just seeing it reported through the category of credit card fraud. And another one to point out here is South Africa. So their highest one was synthetic identity fraud. So definitely seeing that trend with increasing identity fraud within South Africa. All right, so I hit on bonus abuse just a moment ago. So when we're talking about bonus abuse, so most operators use different types of promotions to attract new customers into the game. So it might be, a credit on their account when they first set it up. It could be, free spins, free game. But what you find with bonus abuse is that, fraudsters, they go in, they set up multiple accounts and then use those promotions to go and get real earnings that they then take away from the business, right? So counter to recent trends, we actually saw bonus abuse fall by 39% in 2020. So I was a bit surprised by this because, it's something that we had kind of consistently seen increasing year over year for quite a few years. And it's something that we hear about as a pain point from operators a lot. So while it did decrease, I would point out that this is still the second highest reported fraud type across all of our operators globally. So I think it definitely is still a really large problem. this might be in response to COVID-19. You likely saw, sorry, lost my words for a second there. You likely saw a slowdown in promotions in 2020 as there was a lot of uncertainty. This could also mean that fraudsters were turning to more lucrative targets such as account takeover or identity fraud. Capitalizing on breach credentials and personal data that we've seen flooding the dark web due to COVID-19 phishing scams. So, a couple of reasons why we might be seeing some of those changes there. As I mentioned before, this is an area where, being able to track this with evidence reports is really helpful, because that way you can link the bonus abuse to a device and keep them from coming back in and setting up multiple accounts and exploiting your program. For the first time, we saw a decline in mobile transactions. So this one was really interesting. So, we saw mobile transactions go down to 69% of total transactions in 2020. We think this is really just a result of more people working from home, and actually more people just staying home, right? So they're not out in the pub making a bet live on a game while they're watching it with their friends. More people are at home working on their laptop. So we think that's really just a causality from people being home more due to the pandemic, and this will likely bounce right back in 2021 as we see restrictions lift. Call out here on the right, we looked at the risky transaction rate by device. So again, that's our denied transactions and reviewed transactions. Interesting call out here was that we saw a much higher rate of risky transactions for desktop devices than for mobile devices. So it might be that it's just easier for fraudsters to perpetrate fraud via desktop or laptop devices, easier to run emulator programs, or maybe like the rest of us, they're just at home and working from their laptops. All right, so diving a little more into the customer experience, we saw that 83% of surveyed executives believe smooth transactions are now essential for survival, rather than just merely a competitive edge. I doubt anybody's surprised by that. Really, most businesses are optimizing for a mobile-first experience, really looking at how you can optimize to make that experience easier for your customers and go where they want to transact. 2 out of 3 consumers indicated they'd switch companies for more advanced security protocols that are easier for them to use. And then I thought this one was interesting. 62% of iGaming executives indicated they are increasing investments in improving their digital transaction processes. So I think this, follows with what I was saying before. I think you saw a big move where people had to kind of rapidly move online and try to stand up digital processes where maybe they had been land-based before. So now there's going to be an increased emphasis on, optimizing those digital transactions. So really, as you're looking at balancing between fraud prevention and player experience, it's really important to think about creating this friction-right experience. So you want some friction that's going to keep fraudsters out of your game, that's going to let consumers know that you're protecting their accounts, but you don't want so much friction that you're going to drive away good players. So here on the protection side, having robust identity verification, that's going to allow you, when you're you're setting up new accounts to have a high level of confidence that the person is who they say they are, that it's not, a synthetic identity or stolen identity that's being used to set up that account. But you want to balance that with ease of use and speed. Being able to expedite player onboarding and automate and optimize processes wherever possible. Next, looking at authentication methods. So, after you have that account set up, being able to restrict access to player accounts so that you can prevent, things like account takeover. But again, creating that friction right experience by looking at risk-based challenges. So using real-time risk signals to determine whether or not to add challenges to the customer experience. So some good examples of that is, if you're seeing a number of high velocities from a device, say a device has been used to log into, 10 accounts within your website, that's not a normal consumer behavior and likely something that needs to be checked out. Another type of risk factor you can look at is, geolocation. So if you're seeing that, the stated IP address is in the UK, but the true IP address is coming out of Russia, that there's a disconnect there. So doesn't necessarily mean it's fraud, but it does mean that there's risks there, and good to either review the transaction or maybe add more authentication. And then lastly, fraud prevention. So we're talking about all these different risk factors. So important to make sure that you're securing customer accounts without adding too much friction for good players. All right, so now let's talk about managing regulatory compliance. All right, so we touched on this a bit earlier, the change in credit card fraud. So credit card fraud decreasing and ACH and debit fraud increasing. We think this is likely due to the changes you've seen with strong customer authentication requirements for PSD2. So that within Europe is driving operators to move away from credit cards, which require more checks. There's also recent UK regulation that regulation changes that are causing people to move away from use of credit cards for payments. And then we touched on player self-exclusion a bit before, but here's what we've seen as far as trends for player self-exclusion. So we saw a 7% decline in 2020. So a small drop there, but actually I should probably step back just a second. So player self-exclusion, for those of you that might not be familiar with it, this is part of the responsible gambling mandate. So if a player, they have a gambling problem, they can put themselves on a list to self-exclude, and that becomes the operator's responsibility to keep them out of the site, keep them from playing. There's a lot of regulations within Europe. I know there's definitely some within the US and other jurisdictions. So this can be a difficult thing for operators to manage because, of course, when somebody self-excludes, then, if you have a gambling addiction, that's not necessarily going to keep them from gambling anymore, just putting their name on a list, right? So they might try to come in using, say, a spouse's information and credit card or payment details. So being able to track this at the device level is really a really effective way to stop those self-excluded players from coming back into your game. So we did see a total of 200,000 reports of player self-exclusion in 2020. the good thing about using the evidence reports for player self-exclusion, this also helps operators. They can share the reports of self-exclusion so they can see if there's problems with players moving from site to site. The other thing we see with player self-exclusion in talking to operators is that this is sometimes used as a tool by fraudsters. So fraudsters, they'll come in, they'll set up a fake account, they'll go and they'll play with, say, stolen payment details, and then after withdrawal, they go and they immediately self-exclude. They do this in order to make it harder for the operator to pursue them. So, two different reasons. One, from the compliance angle, important to make sure that you're staying within compliance with the responsible gambling mandates, but also being able to stop fraudsters that are abusing the self-exclusion regulations in order to commit fraud. So let me go forward here. Oh, actually, I was going to point out real quick too, it's interesting that we saw the correlation of reducing credit card fraud and reducing self-exclusion reports, because that was a method where we saw that fraudsters would go and self-exclude before the chargeback would come back on credit card reports. So it could be too that we're seeing a decrease with the reduction in use of credit cards. That could also be reducing those fraudulent player self-exclusion trends. All right, then anti-money laundering, or AML. This is a trend that we've seen the last couple of years, where you've seen fines for AML rising globally. So we saw $6 billion in AML fines issued just in the first half of 2020. So there definitely is a trend globally where we're seeing more strict enforcement of AML. Some of the common tactics we see for money laundering attacks: account takeover, of course, that's a common tactic where they go in and take over a VIP account or a high value account so that money movement isn't as easy to detect. Another attack method we see is what we call account brokering. So this is where a fraudster, they go in, they set up a new account, they might play with it for months, get it to VIP status, and then they actually go and they sell that account to money launderers. So again, making it much harder to detect because it looks like a legitimate account. One method to combat this is by uncovering fraud rings. They're usually the ones that are, working together to launder money. This is an example of how you can see those associations using the player's device. So with this, you can see this first example is a normal consumer device. They might be linked to, a few accounts. They might be working, from their desktop, their work laptop, and their phone. So that's what a normal account might look like. Single fraudster, here you're seeing one device linked to many different accounts. And once you start seeing some of those accounts go bad, that alerts you that, this is not a normal consumer behavior, and lets you know that that's a bad actor. And then on this last example, this is a fraud ring. So you're seeing kind of some of the same behavior as with the single fraudster, but now you're starting to see these linkages between accounts and between devices. And once you start making those linkages, it becomes really clear that you're working against a fraud ring. All right, so what are some of the methods you can take to combat some of these um, challenges that you're seeing within your business? So really, when we talk about it, so True Validate, that's our former ID Vision brand that encompasses our identity proofing, risk-based authentication, and fraud analytics. But really, when we look at it as a layered approach. You need to look at what are the points of risk within your business and how can you layer in protections to, stop account takeover, stop payment fraud. So here at account origination, this is where you would likely want to do some type of identity proofing, KYC, make sure that the player is who they say they are before allowing them to set up an account. That's going to keep bad actors out from the very beginning. At login, here you're looking to protect against account takeover or unauthorized access to a player account. Number of different methods you can take here. You can use multi-factor authentication. You can layer in device-based authentication so that you can validate that, yes, this is a good returning player using a known device with no risk signals. At deposit, this is where you're likely protecting against money laundering. So, being able to see, are there any risk signals associated? Are there any signals that this might be a fraud ring working together? Account management, again, this is another place where you might see account takeover. Once a fraudster takes over an account, they often go in and they change details on the account, such as email and phone, in order to intercept any type of notifications. So here, being able to authenticate those changes to the account or adding in additional risk checks is a great way to be able to stop that type of fraud. Place bet, or actually playing, this is where you might see game abuses such as chip dumping or collusion. So important to be able to look at one, evidence. So has there been past evidence placed against that account for some of those game abuses? If so, that might be somebody that you don't want to allow back into the game. And then withdrawal, of course, this is another high risk point within the player journey. If you have somebody coming in to take over an account and trying to drain those funds, that's going to create a lot of ill will with the player, right? All right, so recommendations looking forward to 2021. Really, thinking through the points of risk within your player journey to see where you can minimize risk and protect player accounts. So looking at those risk signals so that you can add friction for the fraudsters, but minimize it for your good customers. Creating a player experiences that balances the right amount of friction and security. So really keeping that player front and center as you're thinking through, how to layer in account protections. And then considering both short and long-term solutions to future-proof your business against fraud and to ensure regulatory compliance. So, a good example with this is, the growing adoption of privacy regulation worldwide. That's a trend that we saw started with GDPR, and that we're seeing spread to other jurisdictions. So, looking forward to see what are those things that are coming down the road and preparing so that your business will be ready. All right, and with that, I think we'll go ahead and open it up for questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much for a great discussion there, Angie. Some really interesting points raised from that report. As Angie said, we've got some time for questions now from the audience. So please do continue to send through any you may have, and we'll go through as many as possible in the allocated time. So first and foremost, I guess obviously the questions on everyone's mind right now are surrounding the events of last year that are obviously continuing through in many markets in the world to this year regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. What changes do you think we'll see now that economies are starting to open up post-pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you're going to see one. We had talked about mobile trends. I think you'll definitely see mobile come back to dominance and continue to grow as the preferred channel by players. I think you're also going to see. I think we are going to see a long tail with a lot of these phishing scams. So I think we're going to see um, increases in account takeover and identity fraud in particular through 2021 at least. So I think important to think through there how you're kind of shoring up your account origination protections to ensure that you're not letting those synthetic identities or stolen identities into your game.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that. The next questions come through is, can you share some strategies to stop bonus abuse?
Yeah, so there's a number of methods that operators can take to limit their exposure. So, number one, I would say would be just, thinking about how you're setting up those bonuses, making sure you have good policies in place to limit the number that a player can use, but then also being able to look at it at a device level is really valuable for being able to stop bonus abuse. So you can see, like, if it's the same device coming in, setting up, 100 accounts, that's something you want to shut down really quickly. Also, being able to do evidence sharing is a good way to stop that, because a lot of times these fraudsters move from site to site. So if you see that they have a history of bonus abuse, you can stop them from setting up accounts in the first place.
Brilliant. And the next question we've got through is, what about account brokering? Have you heard anything about changes in the rates there, increases, decreases?
Yeah, I mean, we have heard from some operators kind of anecdotally that they're seeing account brokering happening. Um, I would say, when you're seeing account takeover, it might be, difficult to know whether that's a standard account takeover, account brokering. So probably the best defense there is just to make sure that you have a good authentication methods in place so that if account changes hands and you have other people in there trying to access the account. So one great defense against that is device-based authentication. With that, you can use the consumer's device to authenticate them to their account. So that way that this is Joe Smith's account. These are the two registered devices that are linked to this account. And so that if you see a new device coming in and accessing that account, you can do a device check and see that, oh, this device has been associated with fraud in the past. So looking at it from that device level is a really effective way to be able to see if there's any type of risk going on behind the scenes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our next audience question is TLO handling all of the identity proofing requests, or are other TransUnion platforms contributing as well?
Oh, that's a great question. So TLO, that's actually one of our that's actually like our public records database. So that pulls in a lot of information from a lot of different, public data sources. So that could be everything from looking at, fishing licenses that you applied for or property records. So that's used a lot for like investigations. But we also have, credit bureau. As a credit bureau, we have credit agencies that we work with around the world. So we're able to pull in a lot of credit data, non-credit data that we use in combination to create a more robust identity proofing.
Excellent. And I guess another question that comes from me more so than anything is, what would you say from this report specifically? Were there any sort of real big surprises for you guys year on year? I know we asked this last year as well when you guys presented back on it, but especially with all the changes that's happened, was there anything in there that you really felt was a surprise, either positively or negatively?
I mean, so let me think. I think the thing that was most surprising to me was the decrease in mobile transactions. That had just been such a strong upward growth over the last 10 years or so. So that was the very first time we've seen it go down. But I think when we started thinking about it, made more sense, with people being home, that, they would just work from, say, a laptop or desktop device.
And obviously, one of the things that people are talking about in general with regards to the workforce is that we can perhaps expect to see a more remote workforce moving forwards. Do you think that changed the landscape for mobile play in the future, or do you think that people will inevitably go back to it more just by nature of them going out and about more?
Yeah, I think you're going to see mobile come back, because you're going to have, people, they're out with their friends. I think, especially gaming, it tends to be kind of a social activity, especially when you're talking about like sports betting. So I think you'll definitely see that come back. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the long-term implications are with the, workforces becoming more remote and that becoming more mainstream.
And do you think that there'll be an increase in iGaming transactions in a similar level to 2020 and 2021? Or do you think that, again, that's all sort of subject to what happens with regards to, social activities?
It's a good question. I mean, maybe we saw that 19% increase in transactions. That could be, people stuck home, they're bored, so they're going online and they're, using more of their discretionary income to, play games and gamble. So I would say, we'll see how that pans out in 2021. But I think that, the great thing is that, operators, have a chance there with, new customers that have come into their service, showing them, setting up great games, setting up great promotions so that they can keep them in the game.
Perfect. And the next one would be, what about cash advances in casinos? Is there any sort of association or connection with payment fraud there? And if so, how?
I apologize. I'm not actually familiar with cash advances. We don't usually work as much in the offline space.
Fair enough. No worries at
Sorry.
all. No, don't worry at all. Perhaps the person who asked that question, if you want to reach out to us at iGaming Business, you are welcome to, and we'll try and put you in touch with someone who can answer that question. I think that might be all we've got through from questions for now. I guess before we sort of wrap up for today, Angie, are there any sort of real big things you want to highlight? Anything that you think is important that if people were to walk away from today's session with one piece of information, what would that be for you?
I think, I would just look at, as you're looking at your points of risk, really think through, your player journey. Where can you, optimize that experience? Where can you look at real risk insights to, tailor your security so that, you're stopping fraudsters, but, also not deteriorating that customer experience. And, just everybody stay safe out there. Crazy year.
Of course, of course. We do actually have one last minute one. I believe this is something you and I have discussed before, which is about chargebacks and fraud within chargebacks. Someone's just asked if there's any trends you've seen around this, and also any sort of strategies you can recommend to people.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, with chargebacks, you're likely to see that decreasing because the use of credit cards has been decreasing. But I would say one of the most effective methods is to have some type of authorization in place, especially if you're looking at, large bets where a player might have regrets on Monday after they've lost the bet. But having that authorization, you can use like push authorizations. The consumer has to use a thumbprint or a pin code, something along those lines, to say they authorize the transaction. And then what that does is that gives you non-repudiation. So you have that record, that audit trail to say, yes, this consumer did place this bet, and now they're obligated for that money.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that, Angie. To our audience
Sure.
today, I'm just going to post in the chat for you all the landing page for this report from TransUnion. It's been fascinating talking to you as always, Angie, and thank you so much for coming along and sharing your insights today.
Yes, thank you all. Appreciate your time.
No worries. For those in our audience, we did have a few questions about the webinar's availability following the session. The presentation will be available on demand on igamingbusiness.com, so you can watch and share with your colleagues as needed. We'll also send a follow-up email with any last pieces of information and again, a link to that report. Otherwise, we're going to love you and leave you all today, but it's been fantastic having you. A big thanks again to Angie, and we'll see you in the next webinar.
Thank you.